A small island, just 90 miles from the United States, once held the power to trigger the end of the world, not through invasion, not through war, but through a decision made in secret, under pressure and at the worst possible moment. Today, Cuba isn't hosting nuclear missiles, but it's once again at the center of rising global tension, economic collapse, and shifting alliances that could reshape the balance of power in the region. And if you think the story of 1962 is just history, you're missing what's happening right now, because the same forces that nearly ignited a nuclear war back then are quietly reappearing in a very different form. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to October 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over 13 days that changed the trajectory of the modern world. At the center of it all was Cuba, newly aligned with the Soviet Union after Fidel Castro overthrew a US-backed regime. Washington had already attempted to remove him through the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and Moscow saw an opportunity. Protectee, an ally, and more importantly, alter the nuclear balance. Quietly, Soviet ships began transporting medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles to the island, warheads capable of striking major US cities like Washington, New York, and Chicago in a matter of minutes. It was a move that didn't just threaten the United States. It compressed the timeline of nuclear war to almost nothing. The discovery came through U-2 reconnaissance flights, and when John F. Kennedy was shown the images, the situation escalated instantly. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Missile sites were already under construction. Some were nearly operational. Kennedy faced a set of choices, all of them catastrophic in their own way. Do nothing and accept a permanent nuclear threat 90 miles from Florida, launch airstrikes that could kill Soviet personnel and trigger retaliation, or attempt something unprecedented, a naval blockade, or as it was carefully called, a quarantine. When he addressed the American public, he didn't just reveal the missiles, he drew a line. Any nuclear attack launched from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union itself and would be met with full retaliation. Behind the scenes, the situation was far more unstable than most people realize. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment were already moving toward Cuba. US forces went to DEFCON 2, the closest the country has ever come to nuclear war readiness. Strategic bombers were airborne, armed and waiting. Submarines, many carrying nuclear torpedoes, moved into position beneath the Atlantic. At one point, US naval forces dropped signaling depth charges on a Soviet submarine they had detected, unaware that it was armed with a nuclear weapon and had lost communication with Moscow. Inside that submarine, the crew believed war might have already begun. Protocol required unanimous agreement from senior officers to launch. 2 said yes, 1 said no, Vasily Arkhipov. That single decision prevented what could have been the first nuclear strike of World War III. After days of tension, miscommunication, and back-channel negotiations, a resolution began to take shape. Nikita Khrushchev agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States publicly pledged not to invade the island and privately agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, a concession hidden from the world at the time. It was a compromise built on secrecy, urgency, and mutual fear. But there was one voice missing from the final agreement: Cuba itself. Fidel Castro had no seat at the table. The fate of his country, its security, its future, was decided between 2 superpowers negotiating over its head. That moment defined Cuba's role in global politics for decades. The island became more than a nation. It became a symbol, a front line, a warning. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that entire geopolitical framework collapsed with it. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow erosion. Cuba lost its primary economic support almost overnight, entering what became known as the Special Period. Shortages, rationing, and systemic decline reshaped daily life. The country adapted, survived, but never fully recovered. And over time, the alliances that once defined its strategic importance began to shift. Fast forward to today, and the crisis looks different, but the underlying pattern feels familiar. Cuba is no longer the staging ground for nuclear missiles, but it is once again navigating a fragile position between global powers. Its economy is under intense strain, weighed down by structural inefficiencies, reduced external support, and a shifting global landscape that has left it increasingly isolated. Migration has surged, with hundreds of thousands of Cubans leaving in recent years, not in sudden waves, but in a steady, relentless flow that signals something deeper than a temporary downturn. It's not just people searching for opportunity, it's people losing confidence that opportunity exists at all. At the same time, the geopolitical dimension is quietly reasserting itself. Relations with the United States remain tense, shaped by decades of mistrust, sanctions, and political deadlock. Meanwhile, Cuba has been strengthening ties with countries like Russia, not out of ideological alignment in the Cold War sense, but out of necessity. Russia, facing its own global isolation, has sought to expand its presence in regions close to the US, and Cuba offers both proximity and historical connection. Reports of renewed military and intelligence cooperation have raised concerns, not because they mirror 1962 exactly, but because they echo the same logic: strategic positioning, mutual leverage, and calculated risk. And yet, the real twist in this story is not that history is repeating itself, but that it's evolving. In 1962, Cuba was a battlefield for ideology. Today, it is something more complex, a country caught between economic survival and geopolitical relevance. It is no longer just a symbol of resistance or a proxy in a superpower rivalry. It is a state trying to navigate a world where power is more fragmented, alliances are more fluid, and influence is no longer dictated by just two dominant players. Countries like China are expanding their reach across Latin America, offering investment and infrastructure without the political conditions traditionally imposed by the West. Cuba, once again, finds itself in a position where its location gives it value, but its internal reality limits its options. Because when you step back, the Cuban Missile Crisis was never just about missiles. It was about power, proximity, and the dangerous simplicity of seeing smaller nations as extensions of larger conflicts. And today, while the weapons have changed and the strategies have evolved, the core tension remains. Cuba is still close, enough to matter, still vulnerable enough to be influenced, and still caught in a space where global decisions can reshape local realities overnight. The question now is not whether we are heading toward another crisis like 1962, but whether we have learned anything from it. So what do you think? Is Cuba facing just another crisis? Or are we watching the beginning of a much bigger geopolitical shift? And if you want to understand what's really happening and the history of Cuba, No One Explains, subscribe now, leave a like, and stay with Cuba Explained, because what's coming next matters.